Do natural history museums present the truth about origins? Watch our Genesis Impact movie to see a young Christian successfully challenge a museum docent on the leading evidences for evolution.
What, you expect me to believe that?
All these things had to be in place at the same time for everything to work.
Christina, you bring up some good points, but I believe that radiometric dating completely debunks the theory that a God created everything out of nothing.
I don't know any atheist alive who believes everything came from nothing. We always hear that from people who believe, from creationists who believe in creation ex nihilo, literally out of nothing. So the creationists are accusing us of believing what they believe. And I get irritated with that because I don't believe that. I don't know any atheist who does. Nobody says that the universe came together out of, not even Lawrence Krauss, the author of the book. He was kind of deceptive with the title, a little tongue in cheek, if you will. Nobody actually believes that unless they're creationists.
The Earth is billions of years old, which allows evolution to take place.
You said in your lecture that dinosaurs lived between about 220 million years and 65 million years ago. And the human line started to branch off several million years ago.
That is correct. Verified evidence.
And this timeline is based on radiometric dating?
Precisely. It's a tried and true method for telling the age of things. For example, the unstable isotopes in uranium eventually change into stable atoms, such as lead, and we can estimate how long this process takes. These methods are useful for dating igneous rocks, which are formed when hot, molten rock crystallizes and solidifies. Radiometric dating is also useful for dating the ash layers in which we find the dinosaurs.
Since we can't go back in time to watch these rocks get formed or check the decay rate of these atoms over time, what are some of the assumptions that radiometric dating studies make?
Well, you listed one of them, which is the rate of decay. We can only know what the decay rate is today based on what we observe in laboratories. We don't know what the decay rate might have been in the past or in different Earth environments. We have to assume this. In addition to this assumption, we also have to assume the starting amount of the parent element, like uranium, and the starting amount of the daughter element, like lead, using the examples I mentioned.
Again, we have to assume them to be true when we date things using radiometric dating. And if these three major assumptions are not correct, then the ages we get from the study are also incorrect.
Dr. Jonathan Baker, let my audience please know what you do for a living and how your input is going to be important here.
Sure. I'm a geologist with a focus on geochemistry, paleoclimatology, and for that we need to know how old things are so that we can reconstruct past events and past surface climates, right?
Okay, so you're one of the few scientists who actually does radiometric dating yourself.
I have done it myself and know a few of the techniques and have been privileged to work at a few universities where they've got the labs on site and we can see just how that works.
Okay. So what would you comment about these assumptions about how the decay rate may have been different in the past?
So I want to say, I mean, like setting aside the context of this video and what it's made for, it's not a bad idea. I mean, it's not a totally naive question, and it's something that's totally reasonable to come up in a classroom. I think the way it's presented, like, well, I'm going to ask this to my biology professor, and if it doesn't have a quick response, that sounds in this case like he's reading off of a ChatGPT script, that's it. I can ask a few quick questions and he's going to realize he's never actually studied this before, and that's probably a bad way to go about it. Like, why bring it up in that sort of classroom setting? But it is good to know, because this is one thing that their method of teaching is very good at, is finding those little questions and pieces of data that you've probably never heard of. Even if you do have a decent background, even if you are a grad student or a professor at a university in this field, you might not have considered. And the way that he's explained, the radiometric dating and how we do it, there's nothing wrong with that. But she's ready to stump him with those questions you would only find if you were browsing through, say, creationist literature, and things that are unfamiliar. However faulty in their logic, things that are unfamiliar can take us off guard, and that's what she's done here. So the first mistake is in the use of the way that she uses this word assumption. And he falls for it too, interestingly. So if he really did know the background of this, it wouldn't be something he should fall for. And in science, when we talk about assumptions, same as in mathematics, these are not things that we just we think or hope to be true. We never check them. We never can check them. We just need to, accept them as an axiom by faith. And that's not at all how it works. If we assume a decay rate that has come from many observations and corroborated studies that go into measuring that decay rate. Yes, we do assume that it's constant over the life of the mineral that's being dated, but that doesn't mean we can't check the assumption. There are ways to do that. We can corroborate it with multiple isotopic systems. For example, we can simply set up a hypothesis. If this assumption is false, what kind of data should we expect to the contrary? We assume maybe ratios of the parent and daughter isotope, but that doesn't mean we can't check them. We measure those by proxy, by looking at different isotopes, the stable isotopes, and normalizing all the data to that, for example. And so there are ways to check every single assumption. It's not just we throw it out there, we hope it to be true, and if it's wrong, then I guess we don't know what we're talking about, right? So the problem first is with the rhetoric and the way they treat this word assumption, the same way you would do colloquially.
What if we took some rocks that were formed in a volcanic eruption, rocks that people actually watched right out of written history, and then dated these rocks? Shouldn't the radiometric dating age of these rocks be the same as the known age of the rock? The age we know for sure because people actually watched the rock form out of an eruption.
Well, that sure seems like a fair way to test it. If the radiometric age of the rock was the same as the known age of the rock based on when people watched the rock form, it would validate the assumptions in the analysis and the process as a whole to be correct.
Did you know that these types of studies have already been done and that radiometric dating missed the known ages by millions and millions of years?
What do you mean?
Several studies have been done on rocks around the world to try to validate radiometric dating, and it fails all the time. In each of these studies, the radiometric age of the rocks far exceeds the actual known ages by millions and millions of years. In fact, I know of an example, if you let me. In the 1980s, Mount St. Helens in Washington erupted and produced all kinds of volcanic material, including rock called dacite, just like this one, and sent it in for radiometric dating. The results? This 10-year-old rock showed ages from 340,000 to 2,800,000 years, all for a rock that we know was only about 10 years old.
And what do you know about what she says that this happens all the time? This happens every time.
It's a common trope in creationist circles and they kind of trained to think that does in fact happen all the time, because the only data they've ever seen are kind of filtered through these organizations, in this case, people like Dr. Austin and Snelling working for those organizations and saying, look, we got the samples, we sent them to a lab, these results came back as such, obviously this is wrong.
You say Dr. Austin Snelling, for those not in the know.
Dr. Steve Austin and
the employee of Answers in Genesis.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And so if those are the only data you know, then you can say in good faith that happens all the time. And that's what she's done here. Of course, it wouldn't take long to find 50,000 results in Google Scholar if you wanted to look for young radiometric dates and look at those data. Or if you've ever worked in a lab, you would find that we do date young materials all the time, meaning materials that are hundreds or thousands of years old within the agreed, we agree that human history covers that span. And the results come back just fine. I've dated rocks that are actively forming and come back with an age of 0, or that are only a few hundred years old and come back with an age of a few hundred years. So all the time, she's referring to something that is the exception, not the rule. And we've known that since the 1960s, when some of the first studies did date active or recent volcanic materials using specifically the potassium argon method. And this was one of those means by which to test that assumption so that we don't blindly hold an assumption that could be wrong. And in dating rocks across New Zealand, they found that the vast majority did give an age that was indistinguishable from 0. In other words, within uncertainty, it gave the right age. So, and they'll cite that study because within there are also a few volcanoes that gave ages of, say, a few 100,000 years, which is obviously wrong. But why ignore the majority of data, which, agree with the known age of the rock? So then that would give us an opportunity that, like, well, we need to hone this method, refine it, and find a way to test our assumptions and not just leave them untested, because if they're wrong, then yes, the age could be off a little bit. And so from this sort of study, we develop more in-depth methods, including isochrons and the argon-argon method, that don't simply assume we started with X amount of material. We can measure that by proxy. We can normalize all the data again to stable isotopes that don't decay, and using the ratios there, we can determine approximately how much you started with. And if you had an excess daughter amount at time equals 0, and therefore should get an inflated age, right? So what's also sad is she's given the example from Mount St. Helens, and this is problematic for a number of reasons. One, the ages she gives, let's just grant that was the case, and we've got false ages that are up to 2.5 million years or so on a volcano that's about as old as I am. So what does that mean? I mean, if we're dating rocks, if somebody comes back 500 million years in the future and dated that material with the same data, that means they might get an age of 502 million years instead of 500 million years. So to put that in perspective, we're dating stuff, to constrain the beginning of the Phanerozoic, the origin of life, and the origin of the continents on Earth. Like, that is an acceptable margin of error. It's not something that we should try better. We should, of course, cover all our bases. But does that really undermine the history of the Earth? Getting an age that's inflated by a few 100,000 years when we're dating materials that old. So even if we were to take that at face value, then that's what we end up with. But we don't have to do that. We could look a little bit deeper. And if you don't know of the Mount St. Helens examples, there are a few things that do make it problematic. One, that the labs where they measured this were not built and certainly did not have the mass sensitivity in their instrumentation to date materials that young. Because at that point, there is so little daughter element present, it's hard to tell the difference between any existing daughter element and the 0 daughter element, because you've got all that you're measuring is background, electrical background in the instrumentation. That is going to show up. It's going to give you a non-zero reading, and it's hard to tell the difference between that and 0. So this is not a good way to test that assumption. She's resting on a faulty premise here. That it made it out to be like we made a hypothesis and tested it, but the methodology is just wrong to begin with. Secondly, sorry. Secondly, if you look at those data, you have to ask the question, did all of those minerals that were tested form when the volcano erupted, or did any of them exist prior to that? And in a volcanic eruption like this, in that sort of setting, with this kind of material, is very likely to have some xenocrystal material in it. That means minerals that have already formed, they are in the magma chamber, they get erupted with the rest of the molten material that solidifies out. So the age of those minerals very well could be up to 2.5 million years old, and there's nothing wrong with that, even though the eruption is only 10 years old.
I drove by Mount St. Helens 2 weeks before it went off. I could remember that when I was like 16. And it was interesting seeing the news that it had exploded like right after we were just there. And I remember that it blew the entire top off the mountain. So it's not like pristine conditions. There's a hell of a lot of mixture for, a good cap on top of that chamber, as you put it. But when they're talking about that, there were in times of the formation of radiometric dating, we've talked about this before, where there was a long period, like in the 1950s and in the 30s, when this technology was just being developed, and it was trying to work out the scale that works to figure out how to make this effective. And I remember using the analogy of trying to get your weight um, by standing on a scale that was designed to weigh semi tractors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what they haven't done in this case is tear the scale, because they use the conventional potassium argon method, which is fine in general. It's the vast majority of data are okay, but unless you start dating things that are really young or that form in settings where you're likely to have contamination or excess daughter product, excess argon at the beginning. It is possible to get some argon trapped in the mineral lattice, and so you don't start with zero. That assumption is that assumption is false, and it leads to a slightly erroneous age. So that's why we developed the method, a way to tear the scale. And if you've got a scale, like you said, that's supposed to weigh semi trucks crossing the state border, and you go stand on it, and you're like, wow, it doesn't read absolute zero. This scale is useless. That you would never come to that conclusion. You'd say, well, I'm nothing compared to a semi truck, and close to zero means it's probably working, especially when all the other weights it calculates are, in agreement.
Yeah, and the scale maxes out at 300 pounds too. So if you very gently drove that semi truck over the bathroom scale, you would discover that your truck weighs 300 pounds. What is your description of what happened in the Mount St. Helens case? With you say we have examples of hundreds or thousands of incidences where this all comes out correct, and then you've got one or two erroneous instances that, apart from the like say before 1960, whatever it was, when they finally got a scale that works and they can tear it appropriately. How would you explain what happened in Mount St. Helens and that one off thing that they're always going to cite because it's the one thing that fits their story?
Yeah. Well, that's right. They got funding to get samples. They got funding to analyze those samples. So they did have real data from a real lab that's been used to publish other geological data. And that's very important for, like, in terms of rhetoric, it's very important to them to be able to point back to this, say we have our data, we have our methodology, you agree on these techniques, and look, they came to a wildly different result than they should have if you were right. What happened here, I think they knew what results they wanted to get and how to get them, which is why they went to a lab like this that didn't have very high precision, rather than a lab at, they could have gone down to Stanford, for example, down to UCLA, just thinking in the West Coast here. There are plenty of labs that could have done a better job in analyzing these samples because they have better equipment. They're on site, they're built for research, not built for commercial purposes. The other thing is, when collecting material, we have this concept of minerals being cogenetic or not. Meaning, if you pick up an igneous rock, you get different types of minerals in it. And it's easiest to see, say, in a piece of granite. You've got some pink minerals, some white minerals, some clear minerals. And but you have to ask the question: did all of these form at the same time? If they did, then presumably they should give the same age. But it's not a given that they all formed at the same time. And the the rocks that they picked up, none of the standard geochemical or petrographic, meaning using a microscope to analyze these samples, none of those analyses were done. So we have no way of knowing, were these minerals cogenetic? Did they all form at the same time? Would they contain foreign material, like I mentioned earlier? And we also don't know anything about the chemistry of the rock. Is there good reason to hold the assumption that there was no excess argon? And if there's not, we have no way of testing that. And like I said, routinely we do use some geochemical techniques to test our assumptions so that they're not just axioms that we hold by faith for no reason other than convenience.
So what we have is an organization that has repeatedly, consistently misrepresented the data however they can to find whatever shadowy red herring or whatever they can look at to draw to preserve confusion, if you will. I've had other people that have looked at this and have tried to be charitable with this ministry, but just come away saying that no, this is deliberately deceptive.
Yeah, it's difficult there because we really can't know their minds and intentions. I get that. I think looking at the geological work that's has been produced, I can't reasonably believe that they didn't know better. And it's very hard to believe that this wasn't intentional. They picked samples that they knew would give results like this so that they could say, look, we have our data. And I can't underestimate, I don't want to underemphasize just how powerful that is as a rhetorical tool. We see it all the time. You see it in politics all the time. And you see it in medicine. Things like, asking the question about the safety of smoking or the risks of smoking. I mean, you can find a study that's going to make you question what you thought you knew about that if you look hard enough. That's true for, we learned in pandemics and other recent experiences that people can find the data that they need, and it's a very powerful tool in misrepresenting the broader preponderance of evidence.
Yeah, I remember again when historically being an old guy, I remember when there was this big controversy with the tobacco companies and how they were producing scientific studies where they would pay a scientist, give me the information that says what we want, and therefore we can continue to make billions of dollars without having suffer any repercussions.
Yeah, more than I don't know if it's the majority, but more than $100 million of early cancer research was funded by tobacco companies. And whether they got the results, that, I mean, it didn't have to be as devious as, look, here's what we want to find, so here's an extra
I just
$1,000.
need to find 11,800 votes, which is one more than we have.
Right? I mean, but if you produce enough studies, eventually you're going to find one that looks like it could add confusion, right? You might find one that doesn't have results where, oh, we are absolutely confident that this behavior is linked to this health outcome. You find at least one study if you fund $100 million worth of them, that's going to tell you we're unsure, and that's the one you put on TV. And that's what they've done here. They fund a few studies. They know what to look for to get bad samples, to not perform the techniques in good faith. And now they can put it up on TV and say, look, we've got our data, and this happens all the time. Nobody questions that, whether it happens all the time. In terms of people like the girl that's represented in the film here, they hear that and they repeat it. And like I said, a simple search on Google Scholar, if you look for radiometric dates of materials that are of Holocene or Pleistocene age, I mean, be my guest. You have fun sorting through that list, because we have plenty of data of materials that formed in a known age, and they give the age that we expect.
So for those whose Google foo is maybe not quite black belt, you have a couple of links that you might be able to share, and I could be able to put them in the description.
Absolutely. And there are much better in-depth discussions of that Mount St. Helens case. And I mean, all I would say is, like I said, this is not a completely naive exchange. It's totally plausible for a legitimate biology professor to give these kind of answers and be stumped on examples like this. And so I would encourage you, like, just take a quick look so you're at least familiar with it, and you can start asking them questions. That's probably the best thing you can do. Ask them questions like, okay, well, were those minerals cogenetic? Did you perform this test or this test to, or did you just accept those at face value? Did you compare it to these list of studies over here where, we didn't have these problems? we came out with the ages that we knew the sample to be. And so I think it'd be helpful to prepare for that. And you'll find that many of them are equally unprepared to answer that exchange.
Dr. Jonathan Baker, thank you very much for that.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here again.